Success was intoxicating. Eduardo stood at the top floor of his skyscraper, looking down at the city that, in his mind, belonged to him. At just 35, he had built an empire from the ground up, a testament to his sharp mind and relentless ambition. The office buzzed with energy, phones ringing, employees scurrying, deals closing. Eduardo basked in it, convinced that his name would soon be synonymous with greatness. Emotional stories of struggle and perseverance meant little to him. In his world, power was the only currency. As he walked through the halls, employees greeted him with forced smiles and respectful nods. But behind his back, whispers carried the weight of discontent. His sharp suits and commanding presence masked a truth many knew. Eduardo had little patience for those he deemed unworthy. To him, loyalty was transactional, and respect was given only to those who proved their worth in numbers. Stories of resilience and overcoming adversities? He had no time for them. The only lesson that mattered to him was that of winning. Then there was Miguel, a diligent worker, dedicated and principled. He believed that success was measured not only by financial gain, but also by the impact on others. Unlike Eduardo, Miguel valued emotional bonds and the sacrifices people made for their families. To him, business was more than just numbers. It was about humanity, respect, and fairness. But his beliefs made him nearly invisible in Eduardo's world, where kindness was seen as weakness. As Eduardo reviewed the company's latest triumphs in the conference room, he boasted about record-breaking profits. "The sky is the limit," he declared, grinning at the executives nodding in agreement. But Miguel, standing in the back, couldn't ignore the sinking feeling in his gut. He had seen this kind of arrogance before, and he knew life had a way of humbling those who believed they were untouchable. Eduardo's confidence was unmatched, his voice carrying through the glass walls of the boardroom like a victorious anthem. "We've crushed the competition," he announced, leaning against the long conference table. "We dictate the market, and soon they'll have no choice but to follow our lead." His executives clapped, some genuinely impressed, others simply too afraid to do otherwise. To them, Eduardo was a man who had defied the odds, but to those who saw through the facade, he was someone who had never truly faced adversity. Miguel sat near the back, silently observing. He had witnessed Eduardo's rise firsthand, from an ambitious entrepreneur to a powerful, untouchable figure. But with each milestone of success, Eduardo seemed to lose a piece of his humanity. Miguel had worked tirelessly, sacrificing moments with his family to contribute to the company's growth. Yet his efforts were often overlooked, his voice drowned in the sea of Eduardo's self-congratulatory speeches. He longed for a workplace where dignity and respect weren't overshadowed by arrogance. Outside the conference room, employees exchanged uneasy glances. The atmosphere of the company had changed over the years. Once built on collaboration, it had morphed into a rigid hierarchy, where the lower ranks were mere stepping stones to Eduardo's personal triumphs. Family dramas of exhausted workers missing their children's birthdays or struggling with personal losses were irrelevant to him. To Eduardo, their problems were theirs alone. Business came first, always. As the meeting wrapped up, Eduardo adjusted his designer watch and smirked. "Enjoy this moment, gentlemen. We're only going up from here." Miguel sighed quietly. He had heard those words before, from leaders who believed themselves invincible. He knew all too well that when arrogance overshadowed humility, life had a way of forcing even the most powerful to face reality. As Eduardo stepped out of the conference room, a group of employees straightened their postures, forcing polite smiles. He acknowledged them with a quick nod, barely registering their existence. To him, they were just cogs in the machine, necessary but replaceable. He walked past Miguel without a second glance, oblivious to the quiet resilience behind his colleagues' tired eyes. Miguel had spent years proving his worth, yet Eduardo had never taken a moment to acknowledge his dedication. Miguel returned to his desk, feeling the weight of unspoken words pressing down on him. He believed in hard work, in the idea that respect and recognition were earned through effort. But in Eduardo's world, ambition overshadowed humanity. The lack of appreciation stung, but Miguel wasn't naive. He had witnessed enough human dilemmas to know that power often blinded people to the reality of those around them. He couldn't help but wonder, how long could Eduardo maintain this facade before it all came crashing down? Across the office, hushed conversations buzzed among employees. "Does he even know our names?" someone whispered. "He only cares about profits," another replied. There was an underlying tension in the air, an unspoken understanding that Eduardo's reign was built on fear, not loyalty. Family conflicts and personal struggles were ignored in favor of productivity. People came and went, their departures barely acknowledged, their contributions quickly forgotten. The walls of the company had absorbed countless emotional stories, yet Eduardo remained unmoved. As the day ended, Eduardo stood in his luxurious corner office, gazing at the skyline. To him, every building represented a conquered challenge, every light a testament to his success. He took a deep breath, feeling invincible. But somewhere deep within, beneath the layers of arrogance and power, a small, almost imperceptible voice whispered, a warning he refused to hear. The sky might be the limit, but even the highest empires could fall. The conference room was packed. Eduardo stood at the head of the table, exuding confidence as he prepared to address his team. The air was thick with tension. His presence demanded unwavering attention. "Let's get straight to it," he began, flipping through the latest financial reports. "Our numbers are strong, but I see areas where we're still wasting time and resources." His sharp eyes scanned the room before settling on Miguel. Miguel, sitting quietly near the middle, felt an uneasy knot form in his stomach. He had spent countless nights refining a crucial project, confident that his efforts would contribute to the company's growth. But as Eduardo's expression darkened, he knew something was wrong. "Take Miguel's division, for example," Eduardo continued, his tone dripping with condescension. "We've invested in this project for months, yet I see no substantial progress. Explain to me why we're throwing money at something with so little return." A hush fell over the room. Miguel swallowed hard, steadying himself. "Sir, with all due respect, we've made significant strides. The numbers may not reflect immediate profits, but the foundation we're building will ensure long-term success." His voice was calm but firm, unwilling to let his work be dismissed so easily. Eduardo smirked, shaking his head. "Long-term success? We don't have the luxury of patience. If I wanted slow results, I'd run a charity, not a business." Laughter erupted from a few executives, feeding off Eduardo's cruelty. Miguel felt the heat rise in his chest, but he remained composed. He had spent years in this company, believing in its vision. Yet, in a single moment, he was being reduced to nothing more than an obstacle in Eduardo's pursuit of wealth. Miguel's face burned with embarrassment, but he refused to look away. He met Eduardo's gaze with quiet determination, unwilling to let the moment break him. "With all due respect, sir," he said, his voice steady, "we're not just dealing with numbers, we're dealing with people, clients who trust us, employees who pour their time and energy into making this company stronger." His words hung in the air, but Eduardo simply chuckled, shaking his head in amusement. "You see, this is exactly the problem," Eduardo scoffed. "You talk about people as if sentimentality has a place in business. But let me make one thing clear. Loyalty doesn't pay the bills. Results do." His tone was sharp, final. The executives around the table shifted uncomfortably, but no one dared to challenge him. The weight of Eduardo's authority loomed over them like an unspoken threat. Carla, the HR manager, cleared her throat, sensing the growing discomfort. "Perhaps we could find a balance between immediate results and sustainable growth," she suggested carefully. But Eduardo wasn't interested in compromise. He waved his hand dismissively. "Spare me the idealism, Carla. We need efficiency, not excuses." His gaze returned to Miguel, eyes narrowing. "And if you can't deliver that, maybe you're not the right fit for this company." Miguel felt a sharp sting in his chest. He had given years of his life to this place, sacrificing personal moments, believing in the company's mission. And now, with a few careless words, Eduardo was discarding him as if he were nothing. Around the room, his colleagues avoided his gaze, unwilling to stand beside him. He clenched his fists under the table, his heart pounding. This wasn't just about work anymore. This was about dignity. A suffocating silence filled the room. Miguel's pulse thundered in his ears, but he forced himself to stay composed. He had seen moments like this before, people humiliated, cast aside, their sacrifices disregarded. He had never imagined he would be next. "I believe in the work we're doing," he said, his voice calm but firm. "And I believe that long-term vision is what separates companies that truly last from those that burn out chasing quick profits." Eduardo's smirk faltered for the briefest moment before he leaned forward, tapping his fingers on the table. "And yet," he said slowly, "the only thing I see is wasted resources. You believe in this project, Miguel? Good for you. But belief doesn't pay salaries. Results do." His words were laced with condescension, designed to cut deep. "So, if you think long-term strategies are more important than doing what I ask, maybe you should be considering a different future outside this company." Miguel exhaled sharply, his stomach knotting. Around the room, the tension was unbearable. Carla, the HR manager, looked like she wanted to intervene, but she knew Eduardo wouldn't listen. Some employees shifted uncomfortably in their seats, avoiding eye contact, while others watched with poorly concealed sympathy. But no one spoke. No one dared. Eduardo rose from his chair, adjusting his suit with deliberate ease. "This meeting is over," he declared. "Get back to work. We don't have time for sentimental speeches." As people hurried to gather their things, Miguel remained seated, his hands gripping the table's edge. He knew what had just happened. This wasn't just a warning. It was a public execution of his credibility, a message to everyone in the room. No one was untouchable. As Miguel finally stood and walked toward the door, his mind swirled with emotions, anger, disappointment, a deep, unshakable sadness. He had given everything to this company, and in return he had been ridiculed and discarded like he was nothing. One thing, however, was certain. This moment would define the path ahead. Whether Eduardo realized it or not, he had just planted the seeds of something far greater than humiliation. He had set a transformation in motion. The air in the office felt different the next morning. Whispers trailed Miguel as he walked to his desk, eyes darting away when he looked up. He could feel it. His fate had already been decided. Eduardo had made sure of that. The humiliation from the meeting still burned, but Miguel wasn't going to let it break him. He had worked too hard, given too much. He wouldn't let one man's arrogance define his worth. But Eduardo had other plans. Within an hour, Miguel received a summons to the CEO's office. The walk down the long hallway felt heavier than ever before. He had spent years pouring his energy into this company, only to now feel like a stranger in his own workplace. As he stepped into the grand office, Eduardo didn't even look up from his desk. "Sit," he ordered, his tone devoid of any warmth. Miguel took a deep breath and sat, bracing himself. Eduardo finally looked up, folding his hands as if he were about to deliver a simple business decision, not alter the course of someone's life. "I've thought about our discussion yesterday," Eduardo began, his voice calm but cold. "And I've come to a conclusion. You're not the right fit for this company anymore." The words cut deep, even though Miguel had been expecting them. He felt a sharp sting of betrayal, not just from Eduardo, but from the company he had believed in. "You're firing me," Miguel said quietly, more a statement than a question. Eduardo leaned back in his chair, nodding as if this were just another routine decision. "Let's call it necessary restructuring. You'll receive a severance package. Consider this an opportunity to find something better suited to your..." principles. Miguel sat motionless, his heartbeat thudding in his ears. He had known this was coming, but hearing the words felt different. It wasn't just the loss of a job, it was the betrayal, the casual way Eduardo dismissed years of loyalty and sacrifice. He had given everything to this company, and now he was nothing more than an inconvenience to be removed. Still, Miguel refused to beg. He squared his shoulders, meeting Eduardo's gaze. "I won't argue," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I gave my best to this company. I believed in its vision. But I see now that vision was never meant for people like me." Eduardo smirked, leaning back in his chair. "Spare me the dramatic exit, Miguel. The world doesn't owe you anything. Learn that lesson now, and maybe you won't end up wasting your next opportunity." The sheer arrogance in Eduardo's voice made Miguel's hands clench under the desk. But instead of lashing out, he simply nodded. "You're right about one thing," he said, standing up. "The world doesn't owe me anything. But neither does it owe you endless success." Eduardo's smirk faltered for just a second, but Miguel didn't wait for a response. He turned and walked toward the door, his dignity intact, even as his future hung in uncertainty. As Miguel stepped out of the office, the tension in the room was palpable. Employees pretended to work, but their stolen glances told the truth. They had all witnessed his downfall, and none of them wanted to be next. Icarla, the HR manager, caught his eye from across the room. There was something there, regret, sympathy, maybe even guilt. But she too remained silent. Miguel gave her a small nod before walking away. Miguel walked out of the building for the last time, the cold air hitting his face like a slap. He had arrived at this company years ago full of hope, eager to build something meaningful. Now he left with nothing but a small box of his belongings and the weight of betrayal pressing on his chest. The city buzzed around him, indifferent to his downfall. To the world, he was just another man out of a job. As he reached the sidewalk, he paused, taking one last look at the towering glass structure behind him. This company had been his home, his second family, until Eduardo had made it clear he was disposable. But as much as the sting of humiliation burned, something deeper stirred inside him, a realization. He had spent years believing that loyalty and hard work would be enough, that doing the right thing mattered. But in Eduardo's world, those values had no place. Miguel had lost his job, but he refused to lose himself. He took a deep breath and pulled out his phone. His family needed him. They had always been his anchor, even when work consumed his life. He had sacrificed too much time away from them, convinced he was securing a better future. But what was the point of success if it meant losing sight of the people who mattered most? It was time to start over, not just professionally, but as a man who truly valued what life had to offer. As he walked away, his heart still heavy but his mind clearer than ever, he knew one thing: this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a new chapter, one where he would no longer chase approval from men like Eduardo. Life had a way of teaching the hardest lessons at the most painful moments. And Miguel was ready to learn. Years passed, and the world moved on. Eduardo's company expanded, reaching new markets, increasing its influence, and securing its place among the industry giants. To the outside world, he was a symbol of success, a man who had built an empire with nothing but his ambition and intellect. Yet, behind closed doors, something was missing. The late nights at the office, the constant chase for the next big deal, the wealth, it all felt hollow. His life was a collection of transactions, but none of them brought him the satisfaction he once expected. Meanwhile, in a different corner of the city, Miguel had rebuilt his life in ways he never imagined. After struggling to find his footing, he had found work in a charitable organization that focused on supporting struggling families. At first, it had been just a job, something to pay the bills. But soon, he realized the work gave him something Eduardo's company never had: a sense of purpose. Stories of resilience, emotional transformation, and sacrifices for loved ones filled his days, reminding him of the true value of human connection. One afternoon, as Miguel helped deliver food packages to a struggling neighborhood, he passed by a group of children playing soccer in the street. Their laughter was pure, untouched by the burdens of adulthood. He couldn't help but smile. It reminded him of his own childhood, of a time when life was simpler. He had spent years chasing professional success, thinking it would bring him fulfillment. But here, surrounded by people who had so little yet appreciated so much, he finally understood. True success wasn't measured in profits, but in impact. Eduardo, on the other hand, was learning a different lesson. Alone in his luxurious penthouse, he stared at the city skyline, whiskey in hand. He had everything he ever wanted: money, power, influence. And yet, he felt nothing. The silence of his home was deafening, the absence of genuine companionship suffocating. He had climbed to the top, only to realize he had no one to share it with. He had burned too many bridges, discarded too many people. And though he wouldn't admit it out loud, a small, nagging thought refused to leave him. Had he made the wrong choices? Miguel's days were now filled with purpose, though they were not without hardship. Working with struggling families exposed him to countless human dilemmas. Parents who sacrificed everything for their children, young people fighting against the cycle of poverty, and those who had lost hope altogether. Yet, in each story of adversity, he found a lesson. These weren't just cases on paper or problems to be solved. They were people, each with their own emotional stories, each fighting their own battles. And in them, Miguel saw a reflection of his own journey. He had been discarded, humiliated, forced to start from nothing. But unlike Eduardo, who had clung to power at all costs, Miguel had embraced change. He had built emotional bonds with those around him, proving that success was not about who stood at the top, but about how many people you lifted along the way. His days were long, often exhausting, but the gratitude he saw in the eyes of those he helped made every effort worthwhile. One evening, as he sat in his modest apartment, he glanced at an old photo on his desk. It was from his early days at Eduardo's company, a time when he had believed in that vision, before the betrayal. He hadn't thought of Eduardo in a long time, but something about that night made him wonder. Was Eduardo still the same ruthless man, sitting atop his empire with no regard for the people beneath him? Or had life forced him to change, just as it had done to Miguel? At that very moment, miles away, Eduardo was drowning in a different kind of exhaustion. His body was beginning to betray him, headaches, fatigue, an uneasiness he couldn't shake. His doctor had warned him about stress, about his relentless pace. But Eduardo was Eduardo, unstoppable, untouchable. He poured another drink, ignoring the tightening in his chest. There were deals to close, power to maintain, but for the first time in his life, as he sat alone in the quiet of his luxury, he wondered, what was it all for? The next morning, Eduardo arrived at his office feeling unusually drained. His assistant greeted him with a packed schedule. Meetings, negotiations, more deals to secure. But for the first time, Eduardo hesitated. The rush of success, the thrill of conquest, it no longer ignited him as it once had. Instead, a creeping emptiness followed him, whispering a question he wasn't ready to face. What happens when winning no longer feels like enough? He dismissed the thought and pushed through his day as usual, wearing the mask of control he had perfected over the years. But even as he sat in a high-stakes negotiation, his focus wavered. He saw reflections of himself in the executives across the table, men who, like him, measured their worth by power and profit. Yet now, for reasons he couldn't explain, he felt detached from it all. For the first time in his career, he wondered if he had spent his life chasing the wrong things. Meanwhile, Miguel stood outside a small community center, loading supplies into a truck. His new job required long hours, but he no longer counted them. Here, every moment spent meant food for a struggling family, warmth for a child in need. He had less than he ever had in his corporate days, yet he had never felt richer. Success isn't about what you accumulate, he thought, but about the lives you touch. As he finished loading, an elderly man approached him. "Son, you remind me of someone I used to know," the man said, smiling. He had everything but lost sight of what really mattered. Miguel returned the smile, knowing those words carried a weight beyond the man's intent. His past with Eduardo no longer haunted him, but something deep inside told him their paths weren't done crossing. Life had a way of bringing unfinished lessons back around. Eduardo's body was finally starting to betray him. The long nights, the relentless stress, the never-ending chase for more. His empire had been built on his sheer will, but his will was no longer enough. Sitting in his office, he massaged his temples as another wave of dizziness washed over him. His doctor's warnings echoed in his mind. "You need to slow down, Eduardo. Your body can only take so much." But slowing down wasn't in his nature. He had built everything from nothing, and he wasn't about to let weakness steal it all away. That morning, he had woken up with a sharp pain in his chest, one that lingered longer than usual, but he brushed it aside. There were deals to be made, contracts to sign. Success didn't wait for anyone, not even for a man who felt like he was unraveling from the inside. He downed a cup of coffee, hoping the caffeine would push away the exhaustion. He ignored the way his vision blurred slightly when he stood. Mind over matter, he told himself, always. His assistant entered his office with a cautious expression. "Sir, Dr. Isabella called again. She insists you need a full checkup. Should I schedule it for this afternoon?" Eduardo scoffed, waving his hand dismissively. "Tell her I'll handle it later." He had no time for doctors, no patience for lectures about self-care. His empire was growing, that was all that mattered. Outside, dark clouds gathered in the sky, the air thick with the scent of rain. His upcoming business trip would take him to a remote location. A last-minute deal he was determined to close, despite the incoming storm. His staff hesitated, subtly hinting that perhaps he should reschedule. But Eduardo wouldn't hear it. "We move forward," he said firmly, "no matter what." He had spent his whole life proving he was untouchable. He wasn't about to stop now. The drive to the airport was tense. Eduardo sat in the back of his luxury car, his fingers tapping impatiently against his knee. His driver, Lucas, glanced at him through the rearview mirror. "Sir, the weather reports say the storm's getting worse. Maybe we should postpone the trip." Eduardo didn't even look up from his phone. "We don't stop for bad weather, Lucas. Keep driving." Outside, the sky had turned a deep shade of gray, and the wind howled through the city streets. Rain began to patter against the car windows, growing heavier by the minute. The air felt thick, charged with something ominous, but Eduardo ignored it. His focus was on his upcoming deal, the next big win, the next proof that he was still at the top. A sudden sharp pain shot through his chest, forcing him to grip the armrest. He inhaled sharply, hoping the discomfort would pass, but this time it lingered longer than before. His breathing felt heavier, and for the first time in a long time, a sliver of fear crept into his mind. He loosened his tie slightly, forcing himself to shake it off. "It's just stress. I've handled worse." Lucas stole another glance at Eduardo, noticing the paleness in his face. "Sir, are you all right?" Eduardo straightened, clearing his throat. "I'm fine," he snapped, though his own voice betrayed a hint of unease. Outside, the rain intensified, hammering against the windshield. The world seemed to be sending him warnings, but Eduardo, as always, refused to listen. The rain was relentless now, sheets of water blurring the road ahead. The wipers struggled to keep up, and flashes of lightning split the dark sky. Lucas tightened his grip on the wheel, his knuckles white. "Sir, this storm is worse than expected. Maybe we should turn back?" His voice carried urgency, but Eduardo barely acknowledged him. He was too busy scrolling through emails, forcing himself to ignore the tightness in his chest. Then, a jolt. The car skidded slightly as Lucas fought to regain control. Eduardo looked up, irritation flashing across his face. "What the hell was that?" he demanded. Lucas exhaled sharply. "The roads are slick, sir. We're pushing it too hard." Eduardo shook his head, unwilling to entertain weakness. "Just get me to the airport," he muttered. "We don't have time for this." But time wasn't something he could control. The moment those words left his lips, another sharp pain tore through his chest, this one worse than before. His vision swam, his breath came in short, shallow gasps. He clutched his chest, his phone slipping from his fingers onto the car floor. The pressure built, unbearable, suffocating. For the first time in years, Eduardo felt something foreign: powerlessness. Lucas caught sight of Eduardo in the mirror, his face now ghostly pale. "Sir?" Panic crept into his voice. Eduardo tried to respond, but the words never came. His body slumped slightly, his head leaning back against the seat. The storm outside raged on, indifferent to the battle happening inside the car. And for the first time in his life, Eduardo was forced to confront a truth he had long ignored. He was not invincible. The storm had turned merciless. Rain pounded against the windshield like furious fists, the wind howling as if warning them to turn back. But there was no turning back now. Eduardo's breathing was labored, his chest burning with an unfamiliar intensity. His mind, sharp as ever in the boardroom, was clouded with something he hadn't felt in years: fear. Lucas gripped the wheel tightly, his own anxiety rising. "Sir, you don't look good. We need to stop. Get help." But Eduardo could barely process the words. His world was spinning, his pulse hammering against his skull. He tried to speak, to issue a command, to insist they press forward, but all that came out was a pained gasp. Then it happened. The car hit a patch of water and hydroplaned. For a fleeting second, time seemed to slow, the world tilting on its axis. Lucas wrestled with the wheel, but the vehicle had lost control. Tires screeched against the slick pavement before the car skidded off the road. Eduardo's body lurched forward, pain exploding through him as the car veered toward the embankment. A sickening crunch followed as the vehicle tumbled down the slope, flipping twice before landing on its side. Silence, except for the drumming rain and Eduardo's ragged breaths. The world was dark now, the weight of twisted metal pressing against him. His vision blurred, his body trapped in the wreckage. For the first time in his life, he wasn't the one in control, and for the first time he realized he might not make it out of this. The metallic scent of blood mixed with the damp air inside the wrecked car. Eduardo's head lolled to the side, pain radiating through every inch of his body. His chest felt crushed, each breath a battle. He tried to move, but his legs were pinned beneath the twisted dashboard. A wave of nausea surged through him as he realized the extent of his injuries. The rain continued to fall in heavy sheets, turning the world outside into a blur of gray and black. He had never felt so powerless. Lucas groaned somewhere nearby, his voice weak but alive. Eduardo turned his head slightly, searching for him in the dark interior. "Lucas," he managed, his voice barely a whisper. There was no response at first, only the distant rumble of thunder, then a pained cough. "I'm here," Lucas croaked, his breathing labored. Relief flickered in Eduardo's chest, but it was short-lived. They were stranded, no way to call for help, no one to pull them from the wreckage. The weight of his choices settled heavily on him. For years, Eduardo had believed himself untouchable, the master of his own fate. He had dismissed warnings, ignored the signs, pushed past limits as if he were immune to consequence. But now, lying broken in the wreckage of his own arrogance, reality had caught up to him. His mind drifted to moments he had long suppressed, faces he had disregarded, relationships he had destroyed. And then, unbidden, came the memory of Miguel, the man he had cast aside without a second thought, the man whose respect he had never cared to earn. A gust of wind howled through the shattered windshield, sending a fresh wave of cold rain into the car. Eduardo shivered, his body growing weaker with each passing second. Time was slipping away, and for the first time, he understood what it meant to be truly helpless. If no one found them soon, if help didn't come, the empire he had built, the power he had wielded, it would all mean nothing. And as darkness threatened to consume him, Eduardo felt something foreign stir inside him. Regret. The relentless downpour masked the distant sound of approaching footsteps, but Eduardo was too weak to notice. His mind drifted in and out of consciousness, his body sinking into a state of eerie stillness. Lucas groaned again, shifting slightly in his seat. "Help! We need help," he murmured, his voice barely audible over the rain. But out here, in the middle of nowhere, who would come? The weight of that thought pressed down on Eduardo, heavier than the wreckage trapping him. Then, faint but growing louder, voices cut through the storm. Eduardo's fading mind struggled to process the sound, unsure if it was real or just another trick of his delirium. Flashlights flickered through the shattered windshield, casting ghostly beams across the wreckage. Boots splashed through the mud, hurried movements closing in on the scene. "Over here! We've got survivors!" a voice called out, firm yet familiar. Eduardo's breath hitched. He knew that voice. Miguel crouched beside the wreck, his heart pounding as he took in the devastation before him. He had seen many accidents before, but this one struck differently. He recognized the car model, the expensive interior barely visible through the wreckage. Then, as he leaned in closer, the realization hit him like a blow to the chest. Eduardo, the man who had humiliated him, discarded him without hesitation, was now lying broken, vulnerable, completely at the mercy of someone else's kindness. Miguel took a steadying breath, shoving past the storm of emotions threatening to consume him. This was not the time for bitterness or resentment. A life was at stake. His hands moved with practiced efficiency, checking Eduardo's pulse, assessing his injuries. "You're going to be okay," he said, though he wasn't sure if Eduardo could even hear him. As Miguel signaled his team to bring the stretcher, he met Eduardo's half-lidded gaze, and for the first time, Eduardo wasn't looking at him with arrogance, but with something else entirely. Was it recognition, shame, perhaps even gratitude? Eduardo's vision blurred as the rain-soaked figures moved around him, their voices muffled by the pounding storm. His body was too weak to resist, too battered to protest, as hands carefully worked to free him from the wreckage. A part of him still clung to his old instincts, to assert control, to dictate the next move. But this time, he was powerless. He was no longer the one giving orders, he was the one being saved. Miguel worked swiftly, his hands steady despite the whirlwind of emotions surging within him. He had trained for emergencies like this, but nothing had prepared him for the moment he would come face to face with the man who had once cast him aside. The irony of it all was almost poetic. He glanced down at Eduardo, whose usual air of invincibility had been stripped away. The man who had built an empire on power and dominance now lay vulnerable, helpless, utterly dependent on others. Eduardo struggled to keep his eyes open, the pain threatening to pull him into unconsciousness. But through the haze, he saw Miguel's face. Recognition dawned slowly, a flicker of disbelief crossing his battered features. Miguel, the name was barely a whisper, weak and uncertain, as if he couldn't quite believe it himself. For years, Miguel had been nothing more than a footnote in Eduardo's story, and now here he was, his savior in the moment of greatest need. Miguel met Eduardo's gaze, his expression unreadable. A million thoughts raced through his mind, memories of the past clawing their way to the surface. He had every right to turn away, to let fate deal Eduardo the lesson he so clearly deserved. But that wasn't who Miguel was. With a firm nod to his team, he said the words that sealed his decision. "Let's get him out of here." Because despite everything, despite the betrayal and the pain, Miguel knew one truth. Humanity wasn't about who deserved saving. It was about saving those who needed it. The stretcher rocked slightly as Miguel and his team carried Eduardo up the embankment. the storm unrelenting. Rain drenched their uniforms, turning the ground beneath them into thick mud. Yet, despite the chaos, Miguel moved with precision, his grip firm as he helped stabilize the injured man. Eduardo's breathing was shallow, his eyes fluttering open and shut as he struggled to stay conscious. Every bump, every shift sent waves of pain through his broken body, but he no longer had the strength to protest. As they reached the waiting ambulance, Miguel climbed in alongside Eduardo, ignoring the questioning glances from his team. He secured the oxygen mask over Eduardo's face, checking his vitals with the ease of someone who had done this countless times before. Yet this was different. This wasn't just another rescue. This was Eduardo, the man who had once mocked him, belittled him, discarded him without a second thought, and now fate had twisted their paths in the most unexpected way. Eduardo's gaze flickered toward Miguel, a mix of confusion and something else. Something unspoken. Shame. Gratitude. A silent acknowledgement of the irony that bound them together in this moment. He tried to speak, but the words wouldn't come. Perhaps for the first time in his life, he had no words. No commands to give. No arrogance to shield himself with, just pain, exhaustion, and the stark realization that he owed his life to the very man he had once dismissed as insignificant. Miguel met his gaze, his expression steady. He could see the questions in Eduardo's eyes, the weight of unspoken words hanging between them. But now was not the time for confrontation, for reckoning with the past. Right now, there was only one priority, getting Eduardo to safety. "Save your strength," Miguel said, adjusting the IV line. "You're not done fighting yet." And though Eduardo said nothing in return, the look in his eyes spoke volumes. For the first time in years, he wasn't the one in control. And perhaps for the first time, he understood what that truly meant. The ambulance sped through the rain-drenched streets, sirens wailing as it cut through the storm. Inside, the air was thick with tension, the only sounds coming from the steady beep of the heart monitor and the occasional crackle of the radio. Miguel remained focused, adjusting Eduardo's IV, monitoring his vitals, ensuring he remained stable. He had done this before, countless times, but never for a man who had once treated him as invisible. Eduardo's eyelids fluttered, his body weak, but his mind beginning to process the reality of his situation. He turned his head slightly, wincing at the effort. Through the haze of pain, he saw Miguel, steady, calm, unwavering. A man who had every reason to leave him behind. A man who, by all accounts, should have walked away. And yet, here he was. Eduardo struggled to form words, his throat dry, his voice barely a whisper. "Why? Why are you here?" Miguel didn't look up from his work, his hands moving efficiently as he checked Eduardo's pulse. "Because it's my job," he said simply. But they both knew it was more than that. Miguel could have let someone else take over, could have remained in the background, could have turned away and left Eduardo's fate to others. Instead, he had chosen to be here, to bear witness to the man Eduardo had become in his most vulnerable state. Eduardo swallowed hard, his mind racing with thoughts he had never allowed himself to entertain before. Regret, guilt, perhaps even gratitude. His entire life had been built on power, on control, on the illusion of invulnerability. But lying there, helpless in the hands of a man he had once discarded, he saw the truth with startling clarity. He was not invincible. He never had been. And now, for the first time in years, he wondered if he had been chasing the wrong kind of success all along. Eduardo awoke to the steady hum of machines and the sharp scent of antiseptic. The hospital room was dimly lit, the rain still drumming lightly against the window. His body ached, every movement sending jolts of pain through his limbs, but he was alive. Blinking slowly, he tried to gather his thoughts. Then, as if drawn by an unseen force, his gaze landed on the man seated across the room, Miguel. Miguel sat with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. He wasn't here out of obligation anymore. The rescue had been completed, Eduardo was stable, and yet he hadn't left. There was something unfinished between them, something that had lingered for years in silence. Eduardo swallowed, his throat dry, his pride weighing heavier than his injuries. He had spent a lifetime speaking with authority, with dominance. But now, words failed him. Miguel leaned forward slightly, breaking the silence first. "Doctors say you were lucky," he said, his tone neutral. "Another few hours, and the outcome could have been different." He didn't elaborate. He didn't need to. The meaning was clear. Eduardo had come closer to death than he realized, and had it not been for the very man he had once belittled, he wouldn't have made it out at all. Eduardo let out a slow breath, staring at the ceiling. Lucky. That word had never applied to him. He had built his life through sheer force, through relentless ambition. But this wasn't something he had earned. This was something given. A second chance. One he had done nothing to deserve. He turned his head slightly toward Miguel, his voice hoarse but steady. "I owe you." It wasn't an apology. Not yet. But it was the first crack in the walls he had built around himself. Miguel exhaled slowly, studying Eduardo's face. The man before him was a shadow of the arrogant businessman he once knew, weakened, humbled, stripped of his invincibility, and yet something in Miguel hesitated. Was this moment genuine? Was Eduardo truly beginning to understand, or was this just another calculated response? "You don't owe me anything," Miguel finally said. "That's not why I stayed." His voice was calm, but there was weight behind his words, a quiet firmness that Eduardo couldn't ignore. Eduardo closed his eyes briefly, as if absorbing the response. In his world, every favor came with a cost. Every action was transactional. He had spent his life treating relationships like business deals, give and take, profit and loss. But Miguel was different. He wasn't here for leverage or recognition. He was here simply because he had chosen to be. And that realization unsettled Eduardo more than he cared to admit. Silence stretched between them, thick with unspoken words. Finally, Eduardo spoke, his voice raw. "I never gave you the respect you deserved." It wasn't easy to say. Admitting fault had never been in his nature. But as the words left his lips, he felt something shift within him, something unfamiliar but not entirely unwelcome. Miguel didn't react right away. He simply watched, measuring Eduardo's sincerity. "No, you didn't," he said after a moment. "But respect isn't something you say, it's something you show." Eduardo nodded slightly, wincing at the movement. He had spent years ignoring people like Miguel, men and women who had built his company with their dedication and sacrifice. He had believed himself above them, untouchable, but lying there, reduced to a man who had barely survived, he realized something. Power meant nothing if, in the end, no one stood by you. And for the first time in his life, he wanted to change, not for the sake of profit, but for the sake of something he had never valued before. Connection. The quiet hum of hospital machines filled the space between them, but the tension had begun to ease. Miguel wasn't sure what he expected from Eduardo. Tears, regret, maybe even another attempt at justification. But Eduardo simply lay there processing, his expression unreadable. For the first time, Miguel saw something real in his eyes. Not arrogance, not defiance, but vulnerability. Eduardo swallowed, shifting slightly in his bed. "I spent years thinking that success meant never looking back," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "That power meant pushing forward, no matter who got left behind." His voice was rough, but there was no bravado behind it, just quiet truth. "But when I was lying in that wreck, the only thing I could think about wasn't my company. It wasn't my money. It was the people I had pushed away." Miguel remained silent, allowing Eduardo the space to continue. The man who had once towered over him in meetings, dismissing him as insignificant, now lay before him, broken, reflective, perhaps even ashamed. It would have been easy to hold onto the resentment, to remind Eduardo of every moment he had made others feel small. But Miguel had seen enough of life's unpredictability to know that change only happened when you let go of the past. He leaned back in his chair, his voice steady. "So what now?" The question hung in the air, heavier than it seemed. Eduardo knew what Miguel was really asking. Would he slip back into his old ways once he recovered, letting this moment of clarity fade? Or would he take this as the wake-up call it was? Eduardo looked at Miguel, really looked at him. And for the first time, instead of seeing just an employee, he saw a man who had every reason to walk away but had chosen to stay. "I don't know," Eduardo admitted, exhaling deeply, "but I think it's time I start figuring that out." Weeks passed, and Eduardo's recovery was slow but steady. The man who once thrived on absolute control now had no choice but to rely on others. The experience humbled him in ways he never imagined. Every morning, as he struggled to regain his strength, he thought about the people he had neglected, the employees he had dismissed, the relationships he had sacrificed for power, and most of all, he thought about Miguel. One afternoon, Eduardo found himself staring at his phone, his fingers hesitating over the screen. For years, making decisions had been second nature to him, yet now, a simple phone call felt monumental. Finally, he exhaled and pressed the button. "Miguel," he said when the call connected, "I'd like to see you." There was a pause on the other end before Miguel's voice came through, steady as always. "All right, when and where?" They met in Eduardo's office, but this time the atmosphere was different. The space, once filled with an air of intimidation, now felt almost foreign to Eduardo. Miguel entered, his posture relaxed. No longer the man who had once sought Eduardo's approval. He had moved on, built something meaningful outside of this place. The thought struck Eduardo deeper than he expected. "I wanted to thank you," Eduardo said, his voice sincere. "Not just for saving my life, but for showing me what I refused to see." Miguel studied him carefully, searching for signs of the man he once knew. Eduardo had always been good with words, but this time there was no calculated undertone, only honesty. "And what exactly did you refuse to see?" Miguel asked. Eduardo sighed, rubbing his temple. "That success without people means nothing. That power without respect is empty." He met Miguel's gaze. "I built an empire, but I never built trust. I want to change that." Miguel crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. He had spent years under Eduardo's leadership, watching him prioritize profits over people, ambition over humanity. Words were easy. Real change, however, was something else entirely. "And what does change look like to you?" Miguel asked, his voice measured. He wasn't here for apologies alone. He wanted to see if Eduardo truly understood the depth of what he had ignored for so long. Eduardo leaned forward slightly, clasping his hands together. "It means rebuilding what I broke," he admitted. "Not just my reputation, but the trust I destroyed along the way. I don't expect things to be different overnight, but I want to start somewhere." His words lacked their usual calculated tone. There was no pitch, no manipulation. It was as if, for the first time, Eduardo was seeing the world beyond his own reflection. Miguel studied him for a moment before finally speaking. "If you really want to change, start with your people," he said. "The ones who built this company while you took the credit. The ones who sacrificed just as much as you, but never got to stand in the spotlight." Eduardo nodded slowly. He had spent years surrounded by people who feared him. Employees who nodded not out of respect, but out of necessity. That had to end. A quiet beat passed between them, the weight of the conversation settling in. Miguel exhaled and leaned back in his chair. "You have a lot of work ahead of you," he said. "But if you're serious, there's one way to prove it." Eduardo arched a brow. "And what's that?" Miguel met his gaze firmly. "Support something bigger than yourself. Invest in something that doesn't just serve you." It was a challenge, and they both knew it. Eduardo had spent his life taking. Was he finally ready to give? Eduardo sat with Miguel's words weighing heavily on him. Support something bigger than himself. It was an idea he had never truly entertained. Every decision he had made until now had been about personal gain, securing his legacy, ensuring his dominance. But for the first time, he saw that power meant nothing if it wasn't used to uplift others. He inhaled deeply, nodding. "You're right," he admitted. "I want to do this the right way." Miguel studied him, still cautious but willing to listen. "Then start by giving back," he said. "Not for publicity, not to clear your conscience. Do it because it's the right thing to do." Eduardo leaned back, considering. He had spent his life dismissing people like Miguel, men who believed in principles over profits, and yet Miguel was the one who had saved him without expecting anything in return. That, more than anything, was proof that he had been looking at success the wrong way. A week later, Eduardo took his first real step toward change. He called a company-wide meeting, addressing his employees not as assets, but as people. He acknowledged his past mistakes, not with excuses but with accountability. And then, in a decision that sent ripples through the business world, he announced a new partnership with the very charity organization Miguel worked for. "This company has always been about power," Eduardo said to the stunned audience. "But it's time we redefine what power means. It's time we use it for something greater." Miguel stood in the back, arms crossed, a small smile tugging at his lips. He didn't fully trust Eduardo yet. Trust was something earned, not given. But for the first time, he saw the possibility of something different. Eduardo had fallen, but he had also been given a chance to rise again, not as the man he was, but as the man he could become. And as the meeting ended, Miguel walked away, knowing that this wasn't just Eduardo's redemption story. It was the beginning of something much bigger. The echoes of Eduardo's speech lingered long after the meeting ended. Some employees were skeptical, others cautiously hopeful. Change was never instant, nor was trust rebuilt overnight. But what mattered was that the first step had been taken. Eduardo, once blinded by ambition, had finally begun to understand the weight of his choices. And now he had the chance to prove, through actions, not words, that he was capable of something more than dominance. Miguel watched from a distance as Eduardo navigated this unfamiliar path. He wasn't naive. He knew men like Eduardo didn't transform overnight. But he also knew that life had a way of humbling even the most powerful, of forcing them to confront the truths they had spent years ignoring. Eduardo had been given a second chance, a rare opportunity to redefine his legacy. Whether he would truly change or not, that was a journey only time would reveal. For Miguel, the past no longer held power over him. He had spent years seeking validation in a world that never truly saw him, but now he understood that his worth had never been tied to Eduardo's approval. His life, his purpose, had always been about something greater, about resilience, about impact, about lifting others up even when the world tried to push them down, and in that he had already won. As Eduardo stepped forward into an uncertain future and Miguel continued his work in service of others, their paths remained forever intertwined, not as adversaries, but as proof that life could change even the hardest of hearts. That humility could grow where arrogance once thrived, that redemption was never out of reach as long as one was willing to earn it, and that sometimes the people we least expect become the very ones who save us, both from disaster and from ourselves.